So many people think they only have two options when it comes to dealing with toxic people: push back harder or quietly endure it. Smart people usually choose a third option: not to fix, not to fight, not to disappear. Toxic behavior is rarely obvious. It shows up slowly, in ways that are easy to excuse and hard to explain. And before you realize it, it's costing you your energy, your clarity, and your trust in yourself. If you ever noticed, smart people don't respond louder. They respond more clearly. I'm Stephen Walters, and on this channel, we look at the quiet dynamics that shape high-pressure conversations, especially the ones that leave people feeling confused, drained, or off balance. In today's video, we're going to look at 7 ways smart people deal with toxic people, not by escalating or cutting people down, but by making small, steady shifts that protect their peace and self-respect. Point number 1. They recognize patterns instead of debating intent. Smart people don't spend energy trying to figure out why someone behaves the way they do. They don't argue with themselves about whether the person is stressed, wounded, insecure, or just having a bad day. They look at patterns. For example, it might be someone who never really takes responsibility for their part, where conversations almost always turn into debates instead of understanding. Apologies don't quite land. They circle back in a way that still leaves you feeling blamed. And often, right after you finally say what you need, you walk away feeling smaller rather than supported. Because intent doesn't change impact, and pattern tells you more than explanations ever will. At first, this keeps you from getting pulled into endless mental debates about motives. But over time, it stops you from getting emotionally invested in dynamics that never actually change. Once patterns become visible, something else usually starts to stand out. As you hear the rest of these, many people notice one pattern immediately, often the one that they've been explaining away the longest. Point 2. They trust their internal signals more than verbal logic. Toxic interactions often feel confusing, not explosive. Nothing technically bad happened, but you feel drained, tight, or off afterward. Smart people pay attention to that. They understand that the nervous system often registers relational tension faster than the mind can rationalize it. So, instead of arguing themselves out of discomfort, they get curious about it. For example, you might leave a conversation replaying it in your head, wondering why you suddenly feel smaller or less certain of yourself. Smart people don't dismiss that reaction as weakness. They treat it as information. It gives you permission to take your own reactions seriously instead of explaining them away. And over time, that awareness quietly shortens how long you stay in situations that leave you feeling off balance. If these patterns help you notice things you've been carrying quietly, subscribing just keeps this kind of clarity close. Once they trust what they feel, smart people stop doing something many others can't resist. Point 3. They stop over-explaining their boundaries. Smart people understand something subtle but powerful. The moment you start over-explaining a boundary, you've shifted from protecting yourself to asking for approval. Smart people keep boundaries simple, not, "You can't talk to me like that because of my past and my stress levels and what I'm working on." But, "I'm not continuing this conversation." You don't debate, you don't justify, you don't educate. Because toxic people don't misunderstand boundaries, they test them. In the moment, this keeps conversations from spiraling into arguments you never meant to have. And over time, people either adjust or they reveal something important about how they relate to limits in general. That's usually when smart people choose a response that feels uncomfortable at first. Point 4. They disengage instead of defending. Toxic people thrive on reaction. Defending yourself keeps the loop alive. Explaining just feeds the argument. Correcting details gives them something to twist. Smart people recognize when a conversation is shifted from resolution to control, and that's when they disengage. Sometimes that looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like repeating one sentence and ending the interaction. Sometimes it looks like walking away without closure. They don't do this to punish. They do it because engagement is no longer productive. It can feel uncomfortable, yeah, like you left something unfinished. But what really changes is how much of you it gets. When you stop engaging, it doesn't have the same pull anymore. And once disengagement becomes an option, something important starts to change internally. Point number 5, they don't internalize the person's narrative. Toxic dynamics often come with subtle messaging. You're too sensitive. You're difficult. You've changed. Smart people pause before absorbing those labels. They ask, is this feedback or discomfort with my boundaries? Because often when someone says, you've changed, what they really mean is, you stopped accommodating me. Smart people don't shrink to maintain harmony. They understand that peace built on self-erasure isn't peace, it's compliance. This stops you from taking on labels that were never meant to help you grow. And of course, over time, it protects your sense of self from being shaped by someone else's discomfort. When they stop absorbing blame, they release a responsibility many people carry far too long. Point number 6, they stop trying to fix the person. Smart people know this truth even when it hurts. You cannot heal someone who doesn't want to reflect. They don't confuse compassion with self-sacrifice. They don't believe that loving harder will create insight. They don't stay trapped in cycles of hope and disappointment. They let people be responsible for their own growth or lack of it. This doesn't mean they become cold. It means they become realistic. There's often a quiet disappointment that comes with letting go of hope for change. But what replaces it is something steadier. The freedom to stop managing someone else's life at the expense of your own. And when all of this settles, smart people make one final shift. Point number 7, they choose distance without needing villains. Smart people don't need to prove someone is toxic enough to justify distance. They don't require a dramatic ending. They don't need validation from others to step back. They simply notice, I am healthier without this dynamic, and they act accordingly. Distance might be emotional, conversational, or physical, but it's chosen calmly, not reactively. At first, the distance can feel unfamiliar, even empty, but that space doesn't stay empty for too long. It becomes room for relationships that don't require constant self-defense. Smart people don't handle toxic people by becoming tougher or colder. They handle them by becoming clearer. They don't fight every battle. They don't explain every decision. They don't stay where they have to abandon themselves to belong. And that restraint, that clarity, is what keeps their peace intact. Now, I want you to take a moment to reflect. Which one of these 7 stood out most for you? Leave that in the comments. If you want to go deeper into maintaining clarity and self-respect in difficult conversations, this video might help out with that. Thanks for watching. I'll see you there because there's more to explore next.